Morning, everybody. Happy hump day. 6 minutes late this morning. I'm excelling myself. Welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's political correspondent, Ashley Cowburn. Morning, Ash.
Morning.
Afternoon, it is. This is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to do what one of our listeners, Ashton Broadway, did on Monday, which was to go to the effort to find my personal website, find the contact page and send me an email about our discussion we had then on the government selling off pandemic ventilators for £100. And he pointed out, quite rightly, that the pre-pandemic practice exercise Cygnus found we hadn't had enough to cope well in advance of COVID. And had those in power, which was Jeremy Hunt, was health secretary at the time, paid some attention to that exercise, we wouldn't have had what Ashton calls that mad scramble to get our hands on the very expensive ventilators in the first place. And he said, once again, the government shows a callous disregard for taxpayers' money, although at this point, I don't think any of us are surprised. That's our first podcast comment. Thank you, Ashton. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the fact that Tory peer Michelle Mone's husband, Doug Barrowman, who, like her, is being investigated in the UK over a COVID deal for some dodgy PPE, has appeared in court in Spain on a separate charge of defrauding the Spanish taxman. Now, we're not going to discuss that for legal reasons, but look it out online. I'm sure there'll be more to come on that particular story. But first, I want to discuss page 2 of today's Mirror, where something extraordinary has happened. The International Monetary Fund has basically told the government not to cut taxes. This is despite the fact we've had several years of the government insisting they're going to do it, although they haven't managed it yet. Ash, can you take us through this? It's pretty rare for the IMF to go around issuing what's effectively an instruction, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's a pretty stark warning, Dave, yesterday from the International Monetary Fund to the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt just weeks before the budget on the 6th of March. You'll remember it's not the first time the IMF has done something like this. If you think back to the days of Liz Truss's, well, a few days in government, they told her to reevaluate her tax cutting spree as the pound started to collapse just after the mini budget when Kwasi Kwarteng, you'll remember, went on TV.
Yeah, but they waited until the collapse before they went, don't do that.
Yes, that's true.
This is well in advance of a budget we're expecting not till March, isn't it?
Yeah, because, obviously the Chancellor's put forward these spending cuts for after the election as well, which they're already penciled in, which haven't actually been implemented yet. And both Labour, the party as well, has not yet said whether it will stick to those plans. So the IMF is now coming out and actually saying, I think the guy said, in the case of the UK, you might think of spending on healthcare and modernising the NHS, spending on social care, on education. You might think about critical public investment, address the climate transition, but also boost growth. So some pretty stark advice there for the government.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that normally you might expect to hear from the opposition, not the International Monetary Fund, which is independent and above national politics, surely.
Yeah, but it's also a double whammy for the government. They also downgraded Britain's growth prospects, and said it would be the G7's second worst performing country next year. So that's just ahead of Germany.
Not bottom! Yay! Fireworks have gone off in my background. How did that happen? I'll save that for again. Off your 2 thumbs up. It's the new. Okay, I'll save that for another time.
Yes, so there's a bit of a double whammy. It's obviously just sort of weeks or months after, I think it was in November, when the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said the economy has now turned a corner, as you can see on the screen, boasting about that.
Straight into a wall.
Despite the cost of living crisis still going on. But obviously the crucial point here is that many Conservative MPs are sort of absolutely adamant that the government must cut taxes either at the budget or at the general election if they have any chance in hell of sort of turning around these sort of dire poll prospects. I think the Tory chairman, Richard Holman, actually said the other day, expect 2 tax changes before in the lead up to the general election. So they've been dropping heavy hints all around the place. So that might be why the IMF has decided it's...
Please don't do that. Yeah. So what do you think, everybody? Are you okay with the IMF issuing this kind of warning? Mike said this government has consistently told the IMF to get its nose out when they're critical of government plans. The IMF has also been proven to be mostly right, I think, especially as far as Liz Truss was concerned. So for those who don't know, the IMF is a body which is involved in ensuring that kind of the global economy just goes smoothly, right? Bailing out people that might be in real trouble and just trying to keep the lid on a few other sort of idiots here and there, just so that everything goes along without too much hiccups. And it indicates perhaps that they fear that tax cuts, if they happen, might make things a bit choppy. Globally, not just for us, but for others as well. So the IMF didn't bring down Liz Truss, but they had that similar intervention that Ash mentioned there, which definitely did destroy the credibility. Well, whatever she still had at that point, it didn't help. It was another nail in her coffin, wasn't it? Like you say, at the same time, the IMF's downgraded the growth of the economy. Now, that means that Jeremy Hunt has less cash to actually make tax cuts with anyway, if he still wants to ignore them and go ahead. It's going to be about £14 billion that he's got spare. Now, I could make 14 billion go quite a long way. But if you're running a country, it's a bit more difficult. Ash, how far is that going to go for Jeremy Hunt, especially when you consider that Britain's got high national debt and stuff? And I think the national insurance cut he did in autumn, that was about 10 billion. So I haven't noticed much as a result of that personally. So
I mean,
how's 14 billion going to go?
It's a good point. You won't notice much of it. It's almost as if they're sort of giving you tax cuts with one hand and then taking with another, because you'll get the speculation in the last few days that they're also going to allow council tax to raise their charges by up to 5%. And as was similar last year, I think every council in the country almost did do that. So I think on average it was worked out about £100 a year, adding to your outgoings. So it's a pretty big blow again. But there's also reports in the Times this morning on the back of the IMF warning that the Hunt told the MPs in the cabinet that there's a major structural weakness in the UK economy. So it's almost as if he's already starting to begin to lay the ground before the budget of sort of dampening any expectations of any tax cuts, or sort of downplaying the prospect of any major national income, cutting national tax before that. It might be that once it gets to the election that they decide the manifesto is the best moment to do that.
Yeah, it's going to be a bit sticky though, because as it is, I mean, the tax cuts that he brought in November were still ones that he put off paying for till about 2026, 2027, well after the next election. So even the tax cuts he has given us are utterly unsustainable. And if there is a change of government, you've either got to set a lot of things on fire in Whitehall and burn a lot of stuff down, or you just have to reverse those anyway. It's a bit sticky. Now, Hunt says he thinks that smart tax cuts could work. What do you think they are, everybody? Have you ever heard of a smart tax cut? It's like it's a smartphone or something, and it's so much better than analog tax cuts. But the Tory party, like you said there, Ash, is putting him under a lot of pressure to make some kind of cuts because they think that would help them in the election. Is that ideological? Is that just what the Tory party want? Or am I being a cynic to suggest that some very rich people want a tax cut while they still have their hands on the levers because they're about to lose power for a generation and they think it's the last tax cut they'll ever get?
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's difficult because, I mean, Rishi Sunak's under a lot of pressure within his own party. And it was only last week you had one former cabinet minister urging his colleagues in the party to oust Rishi Sunak to avoid electoral annihilation at the polls. Now, I'm not sure if going on to your fourth leader in the space of 3 years is going to solve that problem with the polls. It might actually make it worse. But as you've seen, I think the hope in the Conservative Party was that the polls in the new year would kind of begin to narrow towards them. But it seems like the opposite has been the case. And the government had some sort of frustration. It was reported in January that the cut to national insurance wasn't sort of coming through in the polls. They weren't seeing the benefit from public appreciation for what they were doing. So it's difficult. I don't even think if they do make sort of minor tweaks to tax cuts at the budget, it's going to be very transparent in the polls. Because at the moment, I mean, at the end of the day, the number one concern on people's minds is the cost of living crisis. And if they have less money in their pocket now than they did at the beginning of this government, it's bad news.
Yeah, it's not great. I think they're kind of at the point where almost if they wrote £100,000 check and sent it to every single voter in the country, we'd all cash the check and would still vote for someone else. It's got to that point, and I think they're being a bit dumb if they don't realise there is nothing they could do to buy us off at this stage of the game. I mean, what do you think, everybody? Is there something they could do? Is there a tax cut that would convince you to vote Tory, or are you happy to do so anyway? Do you think all this stuff matters, or is it just, you know, a few pennies here and there? It doesn't make any difference to the fundamental problems or that you might see living in Britain today? Get into the comments and let us know. Now, moving on to the main story of the day. Oh, Rachel says, smart tax cuts, very clever. The Tories win, added back on. Sorry, I can't see the end of the quote. It got taken off too quickly. But yeah, if the Tories win, it's added back on. If Labour win, it's added back on. So a smart tax cut, I suppose. I think Rachel is deciding that they announce a cut before the election, and then after election, they stick it all back on again. So it's all a bit swings and roundabouts, a bit as Ash was saying. Now, on to the main story of the day. You'll have seen everywhere that Sinn Fein, the Northern Ireland political party that started life as the political wing of the IRA terror group, looks likely to take power in the province for the first time since, well, forever, pretty much. How has this all come about, Ash? This is the kind of thing that when I was growing up in the 80s and there were constant IRA terror attacks on the mainland, in Northern Ireland, this was impossible to even consider. You know, Sinn Fein weren't allowed to broadcast the BBC wasn't allowed to broadcast their actual voices. They had to have actors voicing them. They were so banned, they were so militant, they were so connected to the IRA that it was impossible to consider they would ever kind of get power in Northern Ireland. But that's where we are, isn't it? How's this all come about? What's happened?
So, like I said, this is a pretty landmark moment in Northern Ireland. So this is the news that Michelle O'Neill, the leader of Sinn Féin, is set to become Northern Ireland's first Republican First Minister. Of course, this was supposed to be the case back in 2022 when Sinn Féin won the Assembly elections with the sort of highest number of seats at Stormont. But obviously the DUP refused to form that government. And there's been this boycott now for the last 2 years where there's effectively been no government in Northern Ireland. Because the DUP refused to form that executive sort of protesting against these post-Brexit trading rules, which govern the relationship between Great Britain and Northern Ireland after Brexit. So obviously you've had these huge issues, and I think we're on the 4th anniversary of Brexit today.
Yeah, exactly.
So those issues are still not completely ironed out, and you'll hear more about that later on today when the Northern Ireland Secretary Christine Harris stands up in the Commons and sort of outlines the details of this deal that's been reached. The sort of late night of drama between the DUP on Monday evening. And I think it was interesting yesterday, you had Michelle O'Neill sort of suggesting that the idea of United Ireland was now within touching distance, just days before she's proposed to take this post. I mean, whether that's actually the case is a big question mark, because obviously the position of First Minister and Deputy First Minister has to be shared between the communities in Northern Ireland, and they legally have the same rights, but obviously one's a deputy, one's not. So they have to agree on what they set out in terms of policy.
Exactly. And if there's going to be a referendum of some sort, you know, the people of Northern Ireland are fairly evenly split as well. They're by no means all for reunification. Now, someone calling themselves the ex-democratist on Twitter says, I'm not Irish or even a follower, but their Irish Republican and Democratic Socialist political party, does it suit your needs to name them a nationalist party? We could split hairs if you like, but they're all for Irish nationalism. Sinn Féin always have been. Reunification, all the rest of it. I would say Democratic Socialists kind of got put on top of that later. But there we are. Now, so to go back a bit, for those who don't know, I don't know where you've been if you don't know any of this. Right, okay, so the Romans invaded Britain. This is the history. The Romans invaded Britain, the Celts got pushed to the edges, and various rulers have spent about 2,000 years trying to invade, control, destroy, massacre, administrate Ireland as an island, if you like. And in the early part of the 20th century, you got split into a republic in the south and this province in the north, which became part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And if you did a survey in those places today, you would find that some people are really thirsting to reunify. There's also a significant number of British citizens in the province who want to stay British and live in Northern Ireland. And the politics of that place has been divided on those lines ever since. There's been lots of violence on both sides. And when the Northern Ireland Agreement finally sort of brought peace and everyone put their weapons down, it was on the basis that we were all members of the EU. And therefore, you could live and work in Northern Ireland and move across the borders into Ireland like you were reunified if you wanted to, and move across the borders into Britain like you were British if you wanted to, and everyone could pretend that they had won, although no one really had. It was a kind of genius political move. Now, with Brexit, that kind of destroyed all of it. Today, as Ash said, it's the 4th anniversary of the day we finally Brexited, which itself was 3.5 years after we'd actually voted for it. And in those 7.5 years, it was the Northern Ireland border that caused all the problems, fundamentally. How do you control a border that you're not allowed to control? And you have to control it. If you're on the edge of a trade block and you've left it, you have to be able to control that trade. So it defeated Theresa and Boris. Rishi thinks he's found a solution. The DUP leader says this is a solution, but no one has seen it. No one knows if it is or not. And he's also negotiated a £3 billion bung for Northern Ireland for public spending, which is quite handy, I expect. But Ash, I suppose the question is the rest of the DUP going to accept it? Or will the party split? Because surely this is still going to mean you have to accept some differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain, and some similarities between them and the Republic. And some of them are not going to stomach it, are they?
It's interesting because obviously the Northern Ireland shares this border with the Republic, which is the Republic is obviously part of the European Union, and the European Union is wanting to protect and safeguard its single market, so it has to impose these regulations, etc. So obviously you will have these differences that are a point of contention, which weren't given that much thought before the Brexit referendum, everyone must say. But I think the crucial point here is that, like, out of, I think it's 5 out of the last 7 years, you haven't had a functioning executive at Stormont. So obviously this is the seismic shift from Michelle O'Neill become the first minister of Ireland. But obviously up until this point, it's been civil servants in the last 2 years who effectively been running the country, and civil servants cannot make major policy decisions. It was only a couple of weeks ago, last week, that you had 16 public sector unions staging strikes across Northern Ireland. This was nurses, teachers, cleaners, bus drivers, etc. And this sort of paralysis in government has led to a huge pressure on the DUP as well, because public sector workers have not received that pay rise granted to their colleagues in the UK as a result of the paralysis in Northern Ireland. So obviously a part of the package that the government's offered, this 3.3 billion, was to go to public sector wages, which was conditional on Stormont being restored. And this obviously is a huge political pressure, which you've got the strike. I think it was one of the biggest strikes in Northern Irish recent memory.
So the servants couldn't make a decision to make a pay rise. The union said, hello, we can agitate for a pay rise here. It causes a huge load of fuss. The fact that you have that power vacuum then becomes really clear, doesn't it, I suppose, to the voting public. And it's in everybody's best interest suddenly to get back around the table, whereas before those strikes, maybe they could get away with just arguing from a distance. So unions do it again, it would appear. So they've had all these problems, and they've got to try and have some way through it, one would hope. But even if the DUP, for political reasons, as you suggested, if they can stick it, it could still collapse without them, because Tory backbenchers could rebel. It didn't take very many of them necessarily to rebel against it, although Labour would support it. And the EU might not like it. And this deal's not getting published until at least 2:00 today. Do you think it's likely that Rishi has managed to pull off some kind of magic trick that's defeated everybody else, and that he's going to be able to swing it? Or is there going to be some kind of wriggle room in here?
It's difficult to say. I mean, until the details are published later today, but I get the sense that there'll be sort of unification in Parliament over this, given the sort of deadlock at Stormont over the last 2 years. They'll want the government to be up and running again. There is this sort of impetus to get it up and running so you can solve these issues like public sector pay. And I think they're hoping for sort of the swift restoration of Stormont possibly by the end of the week. So seeing how everything goes. But it's difficult to say without seeing the details of the deal.
Yeah, we'll have to sort of suck it and see a bit, won't we? Now, Gary on Twitter says, so Sunak came out with these famous words the other day, we don't have a magic money tree. Where have I heard that before? It turns out you probably can find one if you want to suddenly get a deal on Brexit. John says, people want reliable, decent public services and a properly funded NHS, far and above any tax cuts. The way to fund those services is by taxation of the rich. I was talking a bit there about our earlier one about the IMF. And it's just, it does seem, doesn't it, that there's, Rachel says, could we rejoin Europe? That would fix it. Super easy. I don't think that would fix anything, Rachel. Not at this stage. A customs union might be beneficial, one would have thought, but I don't think anybody is suggesting that after the next election or putting it in any manifestos. So we've also now got this new First Minister, Michelle O'Neill. Now, what do you think about that, everybody? She is someone who, if it works, she would take up her job officially on Saturday and form her cabinet after that. Now, her dad was an IRA prisoner. Her cousin was shot as a terrorist by the SAS in 1991. Leslie says, isn't it strange they've left Northern Ireland till now? I imagine they've been working on this for a while, Leslie, but it's, for whatever reason, they've decided to put it in the media grid right now, or they think they've got a breakthrough now. But back to Michelle O'Neill, she's someone who comes from an IRA family, in other words, but the person is not their family. She says she wants to work for peace, but she obviously does come from a background of strong republicanism, I think. So, I mean, she has, as you said, Ash, she's talked about reunification being closer, perhaps, than ever before. But do you think there's an appetite or a thirst for a referendum on reunification? Is that where we're going to be headed at some point?
It's difficult because, I mean, like I said before, given that the deputy and first ministers share this sort of legal responsibility installment, the DUP would essentially have to agree to it, which I don't think would happen in some soon, given that. But I don't know. I think the first thing at the forefront of Sinn Féin's mind will be getting this government back up and running, doing what the people of Northern Ireland have demanded on public sector pay, and focusing on issues like the NHS and dentistry, and local councils, and all those sorts of things that people have just been so lacking over the last few years, before going on to the bigger ideological arguments. Yeah,
you've got to try and get something fixed first. And I suppose as well, if you want to say that the Sinn Féin ideal of a reunified Ireland is a good one, you have to prove that Sinn Féin can run the government for a bit before we get to that point, maybe after another election at some point. Now, what do you think, everybody? How do you feel about Sinn Féin taking over Northern Ireland? Does it matter to you? Does it not matter? Do you think this is a sign that inside every terrorist, I suppose, you can find the seeds of democracy and doing things a better, more peaceful way? Or is this sign of something worse? What do you think, everyone? I think we've got some comments about Brexit. Rachel says, Michelle is a holistic peacemaker. If she can forgive, there is hope. There we go. I think it's also about being forgiven in return, though. Although she didn't commit any crimes, it's, that's the thing with Northern Ireland. It's two ways, isn't it? It's never one thing or another. So do we have any more comments? I think we've got one or two, maybe more on Brexit. Oh, Rachel again. Rishi's deal was written in water. Well, we'll have to see later on. 2:00 this afternoon, after Prime Minister's questions. And we'll have to see if Keir Starmer wants to make any comments about that as well, because he was a human rights barrister during the times of the Troubles, so he may know a bit more about it. Mike says, since we're about to see additional checks and delays importing goods from the mainland EU to the UK, I cannot see how the same checks and delays won't apply for goods between Northern Ireland and the South. Isn't this a default Irish border? Very briefly, considering we don't know the detail yet, Ashley, there was supposed to be 2 lanes for goods and services going to Northern Ireland and coming out of Northern Ireland. There'd be a green lane if you were going to basically stay in Northern, if your sausages or your New Zealand lamb or anything else went from the UK to mainland to Northern Ireland, it was going to go in the green lane, it was going to get sold in Northern Ireland, you didn't need to charge tax or tariffs or anything on it. And if it was going to go to the public, it would go in the red lane and have to get declared. Now, we've all been through customs. We've all done this. We've all had stuff in our suitcases that we maybe didn't want to go declare, and we went in the green lane and just kept our fingers crossed. What is stopping someone who wants to sort of run a fairly organized criminal enterprise taking meat that's cheaper on one side of the border and selling it on the other side for a profit without them knowing?
I mean, there are some checks and balances in place, but it's difficult to know, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
It's all about the EU protecting this integrity of the single market, which obviously the UK decided to leave in 2016, quite a long time ago now. Back to the question before, I think someone posed was, shouldn't we just rejoin Europe? And it's difficult because I don't think any about none of the Tories, and certainly not Labour, are proposing that before the next election, or even any prospect of rejoining the customs union. I think Labour has talked about this sort of closer relationship with Europe and sort of agreements on veterinary issues, but the prospect of any of that happening in the next 5 years is quite minimal, I think.
Yeah, we'll have to see, won't we? I suspect that what will happen is some very quiet regulatory alignment, and that it'll effectively just move slowly and slowly towards effectively, us following the same rules and doing the same thing, because it's so much easier that way. And no one's really going to complain too loudly about it, except for a few of the wingnuts who'll go, hang on, it's not what we voted for. And everyone will go, shut up, it's working. We'll have to see, won't we? But as I suspect, the EU wouldn't want us back, not after the fuss we caused last time. It'll only bring Nigel back as well. We don't want that. Right. Thank you for that, Ashley. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Now, we have managed to find some good news for you in the world, and here it is. Now, on Monday, the story we didn't actually discuss on here, although it was in the running, the Mirror reported how David Creamer was forced to take painkillers every 4 hours because he had 4 crowns fall out while he was on holiday. He couldn't get in to see an emergency dentist, and he couldn't afford the £5,500 it would take to get them replaced privately. So he was just a bit stuffed without an NHS dentist who'd help him out. Now, after seeing his story in the Mirror, the local dentist has now rung him up and bumped him onto the list. He's getting the treatment. And that's because not because the dentist had the space all along. The practice is really struggling to meet demand. They've just sort of stretched a bit further to try and help him out after it got some publicity. Ash, is this proof, do you think, that the fundamental point and benefit of journalism is, and has always been, really to amplify the voices of people who just otherwise just don't get heard and would get lost in the slipstream of everything else that's going on?
100%. I mean, this guy is obviously forced to live on a diet of prescription painkillers and soup because he can afford £5,400 to go private. I mean, you're hearing these sorts of stories all across the country now. I know Martin Baggett, our health editor, has done quite a lot on NHS dentistry and these sort of dental deserts that people are facing. I think he said that some 37% of adults, or 17.2 million people, fail to get regular checkups. I mean, you hear it I don't know if you heard it from anecdotes from your own family of people struggling to access NHS dentistry. I know from one family member who's had to take out a loan to go private because simply couldn't get anywhere to go on an NHS dentist. And this sort of lack of funding for dentistry is going to have to be addressed at the general election, I think, because it is becoming a real issue. And people using DIY dentistry and all sorts of things to sort of take it upon themselves to cause to solve their own issues, but obviously it's going to make it worse. And I don't know, I think you're going to have to see a lot more commitments on NHS dentistry as the election comes along. And it's great to see that one person here has been able to reach.
The power of the press works again. So the Mirror's actually got 3 demands for dentistry. One is that everyone should have access to an NHS dentist. Another is they have to restore proper funding and recruit more dentists. And also they have to change the contracts. Now, if you think that the reason we don't have enough NHS dentists is because the dentists are all busy doing the private work and all the rest of it, have a look at, if you have a Google and find the Mirror's story, I think it was also on Monday, about the day in the life of a dentist. And he'll tell you exactly what's going on with his private work and his NHS work and how much money he's not getting paid for this and all the rest of it and the costs they have. And it sets a little bit more in context and shows that the real issue perhaps is the contracts and the funding and the way the whole system is organised. But well done to David for managing to get your voice heard. Well done to the Mirror for amplifying it for him, and thank you very much well done to his local dentist for actually managing to get him onto the list and going that extra mile for him. I think it'll make a huge difference, and hopefully, like Ash says, we'll get some kind of discussion about this coming up to the general election. There'll be some commitments and some changes actually made, which I do think we probably need, considering some of the stories we've heard on this show in the past about people who don't have access to their dentists. Right. Thank you, Ash, for taking us through all this. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. We will see you, I think Prime Minister's Questions is at 12. So tune in back on these channels to hear Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak discussing probably Northern Ireland later on today. And we'll see you all again on the other side on Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. Till then, everybody, stay safe. Tatty bye. See you then.